Hello and welcome to this video. On this video I'm going to be looking at the history and evolution of jazz rock guitar playing. I think this is an interesting area to study because when we look at the sort of virtuoso guitarists that exist now on Instagram and YouTube and all that phenomenon, a lot of what they're doing is rooted in techniques and approaches and ways of thinking that weren't so much developed in the history of rock and roll, but were developed more in the realm of jazz rock, especially the sort of shreddy, alternate picking guitar that we associate with heavy metal in the 80s and 90s, possibly has its roots back in guitarists like Al Di Meola and John McLaughlin in the 1970s. Anybody who watches this channel will know that I am a huge fan of John McLaughlin, and he can be seen not only as the architect of jazz rock, but also as the architect of jazz rock guitar. But when we listen to the later legends of jazz rock guitar, whether that's Larry Carlton or perhaps Mike Stern or John Scofield or Scott Henderson, we hear approaches there that don't seem to be rooted in John McLaughlin's style. This is something that's always troubled me. It's as though there's a shift around about 1975 in the world of jazz rock guitar. And that has never been really described. I'm going to try and describe it on this channel. And in doing that, my observations might run counter to the established narrative of how jazz rock guitar developed. But that's what you've come here for, you know. So I know there'll be clever clogs in the comment section that might be saying, no, that's not what happened, and you've forgotten this guitarist and they were really, really important and all that type of thing. But I have actually had a big think about this, and I'm going to be positing an idea or a number of ideas that might be interesting to some people out there when looking at this history. So let's take it right back, shall we? The guitar comes from Spain. It's in the long line of string instruments that, you know, it roots back to the harp and the lyre. The harpsichord. There's always been string instruments in music. The guitar develops in Spain. It's a great instrument because it can play chords and melodies. It's rhythmical and it's portable. So it's a great little instrument. When jazz emerges in the late 1890s in New Orleans, they needed some sort of harmonic chordal accompaniment, and you couldn't go marching down the road in a piano. So to keep everybody in their place, they added guitars and banjos, banjos being a sort of louder version of a guitar. If we go back and look at the early picture of the Buddy Bolden band back in 1903 or whenever it was, right at the beginning of jazz, it's noticeable that there's a guy sat there with a guitar. Of course, once the jazz groups started to be recorded and you get the development of swing jazz, we still see that guitarist there. If you look at the Count Basie rhythm section, we've got Freddie Green still, you know, chomping away those chords. Never did a solo in his life. But of course, the acoustic guitar couldn't be heard. And so throughout the 1920s and 30s, they developed ways of making the guitar louder. Two great jazz guitarists from the 1930s would be Django Reinhardt and Charlie Christian, although we must mention before that the great records by Lonnie Johnson and the other fella, Lonnie Johnson and Eddie Lang. Charlie Christian is important because he comes to prominence in the Benny Goodman band, which is one of the biggest bands in the world at the time, playing electric guitar. But he's a genius and he brings in a whole bunch of ways of playing. Some of it uses like double stops and bends and twangs and sound effects that he's probably got from Django, but that provides the sort of bedrock of country and rock and roll guitar playing. He also plays very, very complex lines, very rhythmically complex and harmonically complex lines, which lay the groundworks for bebop. Charlie Christian is more important than just being the first electric guitarist of a sort of virtuoso note. So now we have these two lines coming through the 1950s on guitar. One could be, and this is electric guitar that is, one would be the sort of country Chet Atkins blues approach, Muddy Waters, B.B. King, you know, T-Bone Walker. You've got that sort of approach, which has a whole ton of jazz in it. And we also have the strain that goes from Charlie Christian through to Barney Kessel, to Jim Rainey, you know, Jim Hall, Les Paul, and all those guitarists, which also has a little bit of that country thing in there as well. That's the electric guitar. The electric guitar is featured in some of the rock and roll bands, but later on the guitar becomes more important, especially in the United Kingdom, where Clifford and the Shadows really pushed the guitar to the forefront. This is probably due to a whole bunch of reasons. One is Lonnie Donegan being so successful in the 1950s with his skiffle movement. So there was a lot of kids in the UK picking up guitars. And also the trad musicians like Chris Barber bringing over Muddy Waters to the UK to do tours. So when rock music starts to emerge in the 1960s, the guitar plays the centre stage. It's the same in the States. But we have the Marshall amplifier. Jim Marshall creates the Marshall amplifier to try and create a British version of the Vox amps at that time. These amps are bigger, 4 speakers in the speaker and an ability to overdrive. And then suddenly in London in the 1960s, we've got this overdriven sound. One of the most important visionary guitarists in the history of guitar playing is Eric Clapton, who in the recording sessions for the Beano album stood his ground and would not let them get rid of the distortion on his guitar, creating that long, sustained sound that we associate with distorted electric guitar, as well as the sort of aggressive chords that we're going to hear in heavy metal. Once you got long lines, you could start to emulate saxophone players and trumpet players. At the time, these blues guitarists that are emerging in London on the session scene, aping guitarists like Chuck Berry and Scotty Moore on sessions, rock and roll sessions, now have this distorted sound. And with the proliferation of the sort of whole hippie thing and drugs and all that type of stuff, guitarists look for ways of creating some sort of psychedelic experience, which includes improvisation and includes aping some of the innovations that are going on, not in mainstream jazz, but in free jazz. People are listening to people like Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane. This is the area which jazz rock guitar is born. So let's have a little look at how it's born. I would say a good place to start would be back in the early 60s when the next generation of guitarists emerged. All born around 1943. There were 3 guys that were friends with each other. George Benson, Pat Martino, and Larry Coryell. All 3 of them are jazz rock virtuosos. George Benson's come out of the sort of Hank Garland school of jazz guitar, which is very fierce, alternate picking approach to guitar playing, very virtuoso. Pat Martino has got a very advanced harmonic method, which is pulling from beyond bebop into modality and Coltrane changes and all that sort of thing. But perhaps the most interesting of these 3 virtuosos is Larry Coryell. He gets the gig with Chico Hamilton. He also forms one of the first fusion bands called the Free Spirits. And I think Larry Coryell can really be seen as not only the godfather of jazz rock fusion, but also the godfather of jazz rock guitar. Larry Coryell's output is, how can we say it? It's not top tier music. Some of the stuff he did with Gary Burton is very important, but Gary Burton is exploring a type of jazz rock fusion that isn't going to really hit home until Pat Metheny takes it and turns it into sort of a million-selling style in the late 70s, early 80s. But what you've got basically at that point is a lot of bands playing funky boogaloo beats and then taking long sort of modal solos over it. Larry Coryell's output at this time at some points is genius and other points is not so genius. It's interesting to ask the question of what Larry didn't quite have right. He had more right than wrong and he was an absolute genius. But I think what he was lacking was the heaviness and rockiness of what was going on in the London scene. Bizarrely, this American form of jazz needed a British person to come in. And bizarrely, to set alight that British scene, they needed an American to come in. So there's a cross-fertilization going here. And here is the key. When John McLaughlin arrives in New York in 1969 to join the Tony Williams Lifetime, they have the blueprint for jazz rock. Miles Davis spots it straight away, pulls him in almost instantaneously onto the In a Silent Way sessions, and then John McLaughlin starts to influence what's going on in that American scene with the Tony Williams Lifetime. He also gets on the Miles albums, and very importantly, he creates the album Spaces with Larry Coryell. Larry Coryell is very open to John McLaughlin. It's as though they sort of come together and then they go their separate ways. They come back as well, but those two characters are very interesting in the history of this. But to really understand John McLaughlin, we have to back up and have a look at his history. He is born at the same time as George Benson, Larry Coryell, and Pat Martino. He was born in 1942. I think those guys were born in 1943. I think Pat Martino might be 1944, but I'm using my memory here. But the point is they're all a certain generation, and they're all just that touch older than the guys like Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton and Richie Blackmore and all those sort of British guitarists that are going to merge and create rock music in London in the late 60s. Now, my parents, my dad was born in 1938 and my mum was born in 1940. Because my dad was born in 1938, he was too old for rock and roll. He was a modern jazz fan. Okay, my mum, born in 1940, had an interest in rock and roll, but my friends' parents who were younger were totally blown away by rock and roll. There's a certain generation in the UK that were changed by rock and roll, changed by Elvis Presley and Gene Vincent and Bill Haley and all those things, and I know them, and they really were the architects of rock music in the 1960s, and they tend to be born somewhere between 1945 and 1950. John McLaughlin's a little bit older. So when he arrives in London, what you have is a guitarist that has started off playing, I think, classical piano, a little bit of violin. He's then discovered flamenco guitar playing, classical guitar playing, in effect, sort of. Then he's discovered the blues through people like Big Bill Broonzy and Sonny and Terry, you know, those two. And then he's discovered jazz, Miles Davis, modal jazz. So he arrives in music. He's a great reader. He's got a ton of chops. And he goes into a burgeoning session scene that contains guitarists at that time, people like Vic Flick, Big Jim Sullivan, and they're doing the sessions. You know, John's a good reader and he's there. Now, the rock and roll thing's happening, and on these sessions, they're asking for sort of Chuck Berry, country stroke blues type of guitar solos, and John either couldn't do them or didn't want to do them, and I think it was a mixture of the two. So they start asking around, and they get a younger guitarist, guy that's born 2 years younger than John, called Jimmy Page. He's a young chap at the moment. This kid can play Chuck Berry type guitar solos, and Jimmy Page is brought in to sort of understudy Big Jim Sullivan and John McLaughlin. They receive lessons from them and how to operate in the session scene. And before you know, there is like a tag team of musicians. They're appearing on Petula Clark albums, on Tom Jones albums, on Rolling Stones albums. They're appearing on soundtracks, Burt Bacharach, James Bond themes, and all that type of stuff. I find this scene fascinating because this sort of pre-Cream, rock music era is really where this music's birthed. It's birthed by people like Alexis Korda, John Mayall, and Graham Bond. John McLaughlin is playing guitar with Graham Bond, and these bands are jazz groups. So the idea that jazz rock fusion emerges out of rock music is not the case. It's actually that there was a fusion between jazz rock and blues that created rock music. Cream, which I think is the first rock band really, especially the first supergroup with virtuoso musicians in, is a rhythm section that are jazz players with Eric Clapton, who's a blues player. But remember, Eric Clapton has the distortion and he's using his blues vocabulary to create extended improvisations. Of course, then the real deal turns up in London in 1965-66. Jimi Hendrix has played on that circuit. He's played with Little Richard. He's played with Sam and Dave, you know. And he arrives in London and he's a genuine blues guitarist from America, but he has embraced the psychedelic world that is emerging at that time. And Hendrix is a genius because he takes the blues and he mixes it, for me, with a sort of modal approach that has come from John Coltrane. When I hear the solo, and when I hear Coltrane's solo on My Favourite Things that came out in, I think, 61, and then I listen to Jimi Hendrix solo on Machine Gun off the Band of Gypsys album, it seems very similar. And Hendrix is going beyond the blues, but the blues is underneath it the whole time. Now, I think a lot of these jazz guitarists that are coming out at that time, the John McLaughlin era, which would be as well as John McLaughlin, there would be people like, say, John Abercrombie would be another guitarist emerging at that time. Who else? Larry Coryell. There's various guitarists working with Gary Burton. These are all jazz guitarists. For me, when I listen to the early fusion, it's exciting because you hear jazz guitarists suddenly plugging in, distorting, getting a wah-wah pedal and trying to play like that. But the truth is, and this is the bit that I know is going to be uncomfortable for people, the blues aspect I don't think anybody grasps, including John McLaughlin. John McLaughlin is signed up pretty quickly, by Alan Douglas, and he gets ripped off making an album called Devotion, which is supposedly going to be the answer to Jimi Hendrix. John McLaughlin is not that. He doesn't play like that on In a Silent Way. He doesn't play like that on Bitches Brew. Now, fusion guitar is probably birthed, or I would say is made real and important on the Jack Johnson album in 1970. John McLaughlin is an incredible rhythm guitarist. As a soul guitarist, he's wonderful, incredible guitarist. And he's a big fan of rhythm and blues, and in London had played a ton of soul stuff. So when he turns up to the Jack Johnson sessions, he starts jabbing on riffs taken from Sly and the Family Stone. Miles, of course, is a big fan. Now, John McLaughlin is great at this. And it is that method of playing which is established on Jack Johnson, and I've talked about that at length. He then forms the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and we get this sort of incredibly fast machine gun-like playing, very virtuoso, lots of different scales, weird harmonies, and that's the sound that John McLaughlin brings to it. Musicians that are around him, where's the Hendrix element come in the Mahavishnu Orchestra? It comes from Jerry Goodman, who has assimilated it and he's transferred it onto violin. Jan Hammer is emulating blues guitarists, but much more he's emulating the sound of Indian classical music. And Billy Cobham is dividing up the time in a sort of from the inside out rather than the outside in. All that comes together and really lays the groundwork. So the Mahavishnu Orchestra sell a lot of records. They do a ton of touring. The record companies look at it and they go, sign more of these. And you see the influx of, jazz players in the early 70s going, well, we need to plug in. We need to plug in, don't we? We get Return to Forever. We get Weather Report. We get the 11th House. And by the time these bands start to do this, they're pretty late to the party. But one of the things that's interesting is that the promise that Hendrix lays down on Machine Gun, which I think is an incredible assimilation of jazz and blues and rock, I cannot think of any guitarist that really follows that on at that time. Their jazz vocabulary is too restrictive in a way. John McLaughlin could bend and, scream with the best of them, but it's not that blues sound. The sweetness is not there. The sort of respect of how you phrase within the blues. Basically, the blues feel is not there. Now, when I think of people like Schofield and Scott Henderson and Mike Stern and all the guitarists that have come in the 1980s, they're brilliant at balancing this blues feel with a jazz vocabulary. I don't think the likes of Larry Coryell or John McLaughlin really pioneered that. I think they did something different. And so I start to think back and I start to think, well, there's one guitarist that was in that scene who is the most future-looking guitarist of the sort of British guitarists. Hendrix is dead. Pete Townsend never had the vocabulary to go near jazz fusion. Eric Clapton eventually sort of falls into heroin addiction and, a desire to make middle-of-the-road records. Ritchie Blackmore goes off, apes Hendrix, but turns it into this neoclassical sound in Deep Purple. Jimmy Page is much more enamoured by folk music and puts that together with a very architectural guitar playing, and then takes the world over with Led Zeppelin. So where is it? Where is it? It's not in early jazz rock. If it is, point me to an album pre-1973, because I think I know where jazz rock shifts, and this is as big a shift and a seismic shift in guitar playing as any we can point to. And that is with the album Spectrum by Billy Cobham. Now, Billy Cobham, of course, was still in the Mavish Orchestra at that time, and he had pioneered this sound. When he records his solo album, it's not just a spin-off of the Mavish Orchestra, Billy Cobham's version of it. He completely changes the rules for jazz rock. For a start, he brings in brass sections pointing back to his old band Dreams and the Blood, Sweat and Tears and Chicago bands that had also been another angle of jazz rock in the late 60s. But also he looks to the blues and he looks to funk. He's there before Herbie Hancock makes that shift with Headhunters. He's there before Weather Report make that shift with Sweetnighter. The nailing of funk in jazz rock fusion. Of course, there's funky jazz rock crossover tracks. I think back to the soundtrack that Herbie Hancock made for Bill Cosby's Fat Albert Rotunda, which is back in '69, very funky, but it has this sort of boogaloo funkiness that was actually coming out of sort of Blue Note with people like Lee Morgan and Lou Donaldson at that time. So, and Herbie Hancock with Watermelon Man and Zawinul's Mercy Mercy. There's a certain line there, but what's going on Spectrum's different. It's a much heavier funk, much more influenced by James Brown. But most importantly, it's those guitar solos, isn't it? For me, what Tommy Bolin does on Spectrum is the closest we get to the lineage of what Hendrix is doing on Machine Gun. Now, I mentioned those classic guitarists that they don't go towards jazz rock, except for one guy that's come out of that London scene. That's, of course, Jeff Beck. Jeff Beck is a rock guitar icon. He's legendary. And since he's died, he's now achieved sainthood in the realm of guitar playing. What he's doing with the Jeff Beck group between 68 and 70 is really exploring the areas that Led Zeppelin are going to go on to explore. Incredible stuff. And then he sort of loses his way. We get Beck, Bogart, Appice, and he's sort of exploring this sort of rock guitar thing. He's got ideas there. He's into Stevie Wonder. There's a whole bunch of things going on, right? But his sound changes significantly in 1974. His actual guitar style changes. He changes his approach. Now, he has always put this down to John McLaughlin. He's always put it down to hearing My Goals Beyond. All right? Now, My Goals Beyond is an acoustic album and doesn't seem to contain the seeds of what Jeff Beck changes to. Jeff Beck changes to a sound in the mid-70s on the albums Blow by Blow and Wired, which is... It's bluesy. There's a bits of country in there. There's bits of his hero Cliff Gallup, but it's got this freewheeling way of doing it. Now, I would love to say that Jeff Beck invented this and say in 1975 when Blow by Blow came out, that was where it shifted. There's a pre-Jeff Beck and there's a post-Jeff Beck. What's interesting are those two albums, Blow by Blow and Wired, were big selling albums. They're completely jazz rock albums, and yet they don't ever get mentioned, even though they're two of the biggest selling albums that compete against Birds of Fire by Mavish Orchestra or the Headhunters album or Weather Report Heavy Weather. I'm sure they sold more, and they're more full-on jazz rock. the exploratory sound on guitar and the actual shift in the sound of Jeff Beck's guitar, I think, is him actually listening to Spectrum and Tommy Bolin. Now, what happens is Tommy Bolin gets accused of sounding like Jeff Beck, and that's because people don't quite get the lineage. But there is some Jeff Beck in there. But it's the earlier rock Jeff Beck that is in Bolin's playing. They're the same as Hendrix is in there and Clapton's in there. But Bolin's got an exploratory way of playing. He's got a way of playing over those jazz changes. It's really, really interesting. So, Tommy Bolin was a little genius, without a doubt. One of the great guitarists of the 1970s. Dies young in 1976, so he doesn't quite get his due, all right? And I think that's a key thing here, all right? But what's interesting is that, for me, the genius is not so much Tommy Bolin. He was playing like that in Zephyr. He was playing like that in the James Gang. The genius was Billy Cobham. Billy Cobham comes out of the Mavish Juncture, he records this album, and it changes the sound of jazz rock, right? He does not bring in John McLaughlin or a John McLaughlin-style guitarist onto that album. He could have brought Bill Connors in at that time, for example. He doesn't. He goes and picks someone, and this is an incredible move, that does not have jazz vocabulary. He decides to take a rock guitarist like Tommy Bolin, but drop him into this context. He wraps the Jan Hammer around him. When you listen to the solo on Stratus, which I think is in that lineage from Hendrix, Tommy Bolin's solo on that is incredible. But what's happening is Jan Hammer's wrapping around him and creating this sort of strange bed, jazz rock bed. Now, this has its roots in that session that Billy Cobham did with John McLaughlin. But John's not playing these sweet blues bends, and he's not got that psychedelic sound. It's an incredible guitar solo. Of course, when Jan Hammer then comes in to take his solo, he plays in some sort of parallel harmony that's absolutely baffling to me. It's incredible. So, when I discovered Tommy Bolin on Spectrum, he blew me away. So I start to get the other albums. He's on Mind Transplant with Alphonse Moose on. I got the Deep Purple album, especially, Come and Get It. I'm looking for it. He brought his solo albums out, Private Eyes, Teaser. I go and listen. There's a track on, I think it's Teaser, called Marching Powder. That's another fiery. There it is. Go and check that out with Narada Michael Walden and Jan Hammer. It's just incredible. But he doesn't quite fulfill his promise for me. The only place you could really go to get that Tommy Bolin thing is Spectrum. Why? Because Tommy Bolin fell into the pits of heroin addiction, and by 1976 he was dead. Opening the door for Jeff Beck to come out with Blow by Blow, sort of playing in that style, really. I could take Blow by Jeff Beck and I could break it down and say that's ripped off from there, and that's ripped off from there, and that's ripped off from there. Not ripped off, it really deeply influenced. Jeff Beck said himself that he was not interested in music. When he heard the Mavish Juncture and the jazz rock guys, it got him excited. He wanted to play again. Jeff Beck was not a writer, right? He was a guitarist. His great talent was to be able to play a tune like, say, Hank Marvin can play a tune on guitar. He can play a tune like a singer, right? There's not many guitarists can do that. As a soloist, he's incredible, but he wanted to be in that context. He wanted that context that I think he heard on Spectrum, right? Tommy Bolin by 1976 has gone. Blow by Blow comes out in 1975. Then by the late 70s, we have a whole host of guitar players that are emerging at that time. There's George Icarus Johnson, Peter Marinau, there's Larry Carlton, there's Lee Ritner. And all of them are sort of doing this to different levels of success. Larry Carlton is definitely one of the main guys, I think, for bringing in that sort of blues, tasty, bendy way of playing with a jazz vocabulary. Right? But Larry Carlton, for me, does not have the fire, and he does not have this psychedelic overkill of Hendrix. When I was listening to jazz rock fusion, there was one guitarist that, for me, was up there with Al Di Meola, with Bill Connors, with Larry Coryell, with John McLaughlin, and that was Ray Gomez. I want to pay tribute to Ray Gomez, possibly the most underrated guitarist of the 20th century. Ray Gomez started off in a pop band over in Spain. I wish I could tell you the name of it, but he had chart success and he started playing all over Spain. In the early to mid 70s, he ends up jamming up with Carmine Appice, Vanilla Fudge, playing their own role in the development of jazz rock, which hasn't been mentioned. Also, the development of Led Zeppelin sort of lifestyle, at least. He jams up, and Carmine Appice spots what Ray's doing, and he goes back to the States and starts telling everybody about how incredible this is. Before you know it, you've got Beck, Bogart, Appice. But because Carmine had spotted him, Ray then arrives in America, 74, 75. At that point, we see another drummer going off to make their first solo album. This is going to be a theme. This is one of the themes that sort of ties this video up. So we have Billy Cobham come out, and he almost like decides not to go down the Machine Gun John McLaughlin route. He goes and gets Tommy Bolin, a pure rock guitarist. It's incredible. Changes the world of guitar, I believe. Jeff Beck takes it on. That sound sells a million records. We now have this different sound going on. Jeff Beck also being a rock guitarist. We have Lenny White. Return to Forever in 1974-75 are about to eclipse the Mavish Noctua. They're going from arena, up to arena level as a band. Incredible stuff. Bill Connors had been the original guitarist, and he was exploring something that was very John McLaughlin-esque, very wild. There's not that much blues in there, but it was interesting how wild it was. But then Al Di Meola comes in with this sort of machine gun flamenco Latin American approach. That is very influenced, like laying the groundwork for the sort of shred guitar players, influencing people like Yngwie Malmsteen, that's a certain line there. But again, it's this jazz rock machine gun guitar solo. Lenny White then goes and makes his first solo album, and he employs Ray Gomez on that album, and it features a whole bunch of guitarists on there. I know that Al Di Meola appears on that, as well as Larry Coryell, but the guitar solo everyone remembers is Ray Gomez's guitar solo on Mating Drive. I bought this album when I was very young, and when I heard Mate in Drive, what I heard there was the integration of that sort of John McLaughlin fire machine gun attack with the tasty blues psychedelic explorations of Jimi Hendrix. For me, Ray Gomez was the guy, right? Stanley Clarke then spots him, he brings him on and he plays that incredible guitar solo on School Days, and Ray Gomez starts to appear on a whole bunch of albums. Now, in 1976, Narada Michael Walden exits the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and the same thing happens. He makes an album, called The Garden of Love Light, in which he does not employ John McLaughlin. He brings in Jeff Beck, however. Jeff Beck's there, but also we have Ray Gomez. Ray Gomez, I believe, took over the torch that was almost handed to him by the death of Tommy Bolin in 75. And I think guitar players saw what he did and it influenced guitar players. It's definitely influenced me. For me, Ray is like the first true jazz rock guitarist that's assimilated all those things. His star starts to rise, and in 1980 he signs a major label deal. On that album there is a tune called West Side Boogie. Go and check it out, go and listen to it, because there's a new sound on there. There's the Ray Gomez sound on there, and to me it ushers in another change in Jeff Beck's approach on guitar. Jeff Beck again reinvents himself, and there is a certain, rather than having that sort of Les Paul approach of Wired, there's a Strat approach that we hear on There and Back. And there's a certain sound, a certain note choice. I hear it first on Ray's album. And of course, Steely Dan play a very important role in hiring some of these guitarists and getting them to do very tasty, bluesy bass guitar solos, but with a jazz vocabulary on their albums. So now we're going into the 1980s, and this sound is sort of there. Miles Davis, of course, who'd played such an important role in bringing the guitar in, originally with George Benson and then Joe Beck, and then he got John McLaughlin in, John McLaughlin laying all that groundwork. And you feel that Miles is looking for something, and he feels like he had it with John McLaughlin. But by 75, he's in this sort of drug-fueled, what do you call it when somebody goes, a hermit. He's in the sort of drug-fueled hermitage of his period from 75 to 1980. He comes back in 1980 and he puts an incredible band together again with all this new talent. Marcus Miller, I first heard on a Lenny White album when he was about 15 years old. We got Marcus on there, and on guitar we've got Mike Stern. Mike Stern is one of these guitarists that's in that lineage. I would love to know how much Ray Gomez influenced Mike Stern. And on the solo Fat Time off the first album that Miles did when he came back, Man with the Horn, Mike Stern really lays the groundwork for a sort of vocabulary that includes bebop, the blues, Hendrix, and even outside playing Ornette Coleman. It's all there on those first albums. We Want Miles, the live album, being just essential listening to anybody who is interested in jazz rock guitar. Mike Stern's a very, very important guitarist at that time, but of course he is ensconced with his drug habit, and he's hanging out with Jaco Pastorius, quite disastrously. So Miles brings in John Scofield. Now, Scofield's interesting. Scofield also emerges for me on a Billy Cobham album, The Life and Times of Billy Cobham. And his approach there, it's like if you take that Larry Coryell, Gary Burton line of guitar playing through guitar teachers like Mick Goodrick, but then make it high-powered and sounding like John McLaughlin. That's what he sounds like. He sounds like a very high-powered guitarist, although you can hear the phrasings there. But that blues aspect is not so much there. He then starts to do a number of solo albums. I have those solo albums, and he seems to be playing in the same area that Mick Goodrick was in. Mick Goodrick was a teacher and a guitarist with Gary Burton, and he really took on that sound that Gary Burton had pioneered onto guitar, eventually teaching Pat Metheny. Pat Metheny then takes over, and then Pat Metheny brings in that approach, which has no blues in it whatsoever, except for playing a sort of jazz blues, but there's no bends or anything like that. He does that 75, and we have that sound becoming very, very important. But Schofield, in the late 70s, his solo albums are very much within that realm. Post-bebop, post-Gary Burton, Ornette Coleman influenced guitar playing. When he gets the gig with Miles, coming in after Mike Stern, he starts to dig into the blues, right? If you listen to his own albums and listen to his playing on, say, Electric Outlet, we see a shift towards that. But it's, for me, the genius is laid down on the album Still Warm in 1985. It takes time for this to develop. Also coming up at that time is a very young guitarist who's taken a lesson with Joe Pass, who had his jazz chops down, but was also a huge Richie Blackmore fan, a rock guy. And this, for me, is the first kid to emerge that's grown up like I did, listened to Led Zeppelin and Richie Blackmore. And that's, of course, Scott Henderson. This style is really established there. For me, the greatest jazz rock guitarist, and for me that means the greatest guitarist, my favourite guitarist of all time is Scott Henderson. I think Scott Henderson can do all these things incredibly. As the 80s roll on, Mike Stern brings out a number of albums where he starts to really take cues from the Brecker brothers and bringing in these bebop influence heads, most notably the tune Chromosome, which I think came out around about 1986, which for me establishes the sound of internet, Instagram jazz rock fusion, right? Which is this. You have a bebop head with lots of kicks and starts, right? And then when you get to the solo, the guitarist will play a mixture of really tasty blues licks with a whole bunch of fast picking and, that sort of things, and a few tasty outside notes, but not too outside. And this has become a cliche in the realm of jazz rock, but it does take a while to get there. Now, if we look at the established history, we could go on about people like Pat Metheny, who was very, very important, and he creates his own style within that. But this line of, fiery rock guitar with a jazz vocabulary, for me, I've just described the line, and by the 1980s, it's completely there. And people like Stern, Schofield, and Scott Henderson are the guys that absolutely nail it. We then get guitarists emerging which are much more left field for me. Bill Frisell has a little bit of this, a little bit of country, a little bit of Americana in there. But I always feel that Bill could play a mean blues and get those bends if he wanted to. So that's where we're at. Now, there is then a history that comes in. And the virtuosity starts to come back, because in the 1980s, we get this explosion of virtuoso rock guitarists that are sort of light years ahead of any guitarist in the 70s. Eddie Van Halen and Uli John Roth and Michael Schenker and Randy Rhoads provide the groundwork for that. But suddenly there's these fast pickers, and then emerging out of nowhere, Alan Holdsworth comes in with a harmonic vocabulary, approach on guitar, approach to harmony, approach to everything, which is going to slowly revolutionize jazz rock to the point now that most soloists on any instrument now that's playing in the jazz realm has taken something from Alan Holdsworth. You almost want another video to explain the lineage through certain jazz musicians to Alan, and then from Alan back into jazz, because it doesn't happen straight away. But by the 1980s, suddenly we've got Alan Holdsworth there, we get Frank Gambale with his economy picking and sweep picking, and that starts to add something to. These all get mixed up into this realm where people like Joe Satriani and Steve Vai are selling millions of records, and they get swept up in that, and before you know it, our new jazz rock fusion heroes like Frank Gambale, although being bald, is stood in front of you with this great sort of hair metal wig on, very tight spandex trousers, cutaway t-shirts, playing some sort of yellow solid body guitar that, Where's My Montgomery would not have been seen dead in playing and burning all over the guitar. And then from that, we get the emergence of a sort of very high virtuoso level guitar playing. And within that, there's guitarists like Greg Howe that seem to occupy a space somewhere between heavy metal and jazz. I think Greg Howe has now moved over to being a complete fusion guitarist, hasn't he? So that is my evolution of jazz rock. The last 30 years or so I haven't covered. We've had some incredible guitarists emerge in that time. I think Kurt Rosenwinkel is one. I think Julian Lage, or Lage, or however you say his name, is another one. I am not that knowing of those styles, and the reason is because I feel that both of those guitarists have retreated back from this psychedelic blues overkill that I heard on Machine Gun that goes through that lineage. That aspect of guitar playing has disappeared as the blues and rhythm and blues has retreated from pop music. People don't seem to have an ear for that anymore. I was very pleased to see Eric Gales appear on Rick Beato's channel. And I've been enjoying some of his solos. For me, Eric Gales has more of the spirit of jazz than most jazz rock fusion guitarists at the moment. When I listen to him, he is lost in his improvisations with no limits. It's complete freedom. Is it a jazz vocabulary? I don't know. I wish there was a musician out there that would go, right, I'm going to make a jazz album, but I'm going to have Eric Gales on guitar. I wish there was a Billy Cobham or an Alphonse Mouzon or a Stanley Clarke or an Arada Michael Walden that wanted to explore that, or Miles Davis that wanted to mess with these ideas. When I criticise jazz, I think my criticism can be put very simply like this. It's a closed shop, and you have to respect the tradition to end up in there. So Eric Gales, who is not a jazz musician, is not there. I wish he was, because I think that's what jazz needs to do. It needs to open itself up and learn and marry itself to styles outside and just accept them in the same way as Billy Cobham accepted the funk and he accepted Tommy Bolin. I would love to hear Eric Gales brought into a jazz realm. I would love to hear all sorts of different players from outside brought into a jazz realm. Heavy metal guitarists, noise guitarists, avant-garde musicians, rappers, poets. That would be very interesting. Of course, there will be people doing this out in the jazz realm. But is it creating the waves that Billy Cobham did with Spectrum? I don't know. It's all very interesting, but I'm hoping this evolution I've described makes more sense, puts at the heart of it this marriage between rock guitar, blues rock guitar, and jazz vocabulary, and shows how that was negotiated over time, and hopefully throws up a couple of names into the realm of jazz rock guitar legendariness. And those two guitarists for me would have to be Tommy Bolin and Ray Gomez. Now, I've been in conversation with Ray Gomez a number of times now, and I really want him to come on and tell his tale in music. I really do feel he's one of the most underrated guitarists of all time. He really is. And I think we're at a period where people need to rediscover what he did. I don't think his solo album's in print at the moment, which is a shame. His solo album does have vocals on it and does sort of fall into that late 70s, early 80s problem, how we're going to promote jazz rock fusion into the 80s. But there's some incredible playing on there as well. But if you want to check out what I'm talking about, go back and listen to Mating Drive by Lenny White with Ray Gomez on guitar, and then go and put on Blow by Blow by Jeff Beck, and go and listen to Scatterbrain and see if you can hear any similarity there. So that is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like these more serious videos where it gets to have a think about music, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I got no problem with that. I throw these ideas out for you. It's an observation I've made of the history of jazz rock. Does anyone even care about that? Well, I do, and I hope you do too. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope I have promoted in your mind a little bit of thought to go, yeah, I haven't thought about that. Now I know Jeff Beck being dead and being a legend, it might have upset some of the Jeff Beck fans. I love Jeff Beck, right? But the idea that he just pulled innovation out of nowhere, he was just putting his beautifully coiffed rock and roll hairstyle and up to the heavens and just pulling in inspiration from nowhere is not the case. And sometimes when that happens, certain people are the unsung heroes, and I believe Ray Gomez is one of those guys. Hopefully, I can persuade Ray to come on the channel and have a chat about all this and see whether he thinks my theories are correct, and also just tell us the wealth of stories, because he was there at so many important points in the history of jazz rock in that second periods from 75 to 80, which doesn't get discussed that much. So I think I've covered it now. 50 minutes, that will do it. If you like this video, stick a like on. If you want to see some more, subscribe. I've got Patreon, I've got PayPal tip jars members. It's all down there below. Go and check the links out and tell me what you think. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.